This is Professor Michael Chapman. I'm one of the most experienced IVF doctors in Australia. I believe that an important part that I can contribute is to educate patients in relation to fertility, infertility, and all that involves. These series of podcasts help to educate you. I hope they are helpful to you. If you wish to know more, however, I'm more than happy to have you contact me via email, which is profmchapman@gmail.com, or make an appointment to see me on 9138 4222. I thought we'd talk about frozen embryos. If we go back, and it's one of the advantages of being around for a while, the first successful frozen embryo transfer was in fact in Australia. That was the first in the world back in down in Melbourne. And frozen embryos have become part of the strategy for fertility treatment ever since. The method that was used in those days, and actually continued until just over a decade ago, was something called slow freezing, where an embryo was put into a refrigerator. Gradually the temperature was lowered over 2 hours down to minus 76, and then the embryo was stored in that way. When we talked to patients about our results with slow freezing, they were about 50% less than having a fresh transfer. We tried to avoid frozen embryos in those days. What happened about a decade ago was that a new technique called vitrification was developed, where the embryo, once it's been dried out, is basically dropped into liquid nitrogen at minus 76 instantly. And that rapid process turned out to actually produce embryos when they were thawed with pregnancy rates identical to a fresh transfer, to the transfer of a fresh good blastocyst. And so now we're quite comfortable freezing embryo. And so what's grown up over the last 5 years or so are clinics that only put back frozen embryos. So you do your embryo, you do your IVF cycle, you have your eggs collected, you have the embryos created, and then they're frozen. Then the embryo is put back at your and the doctor's convenience the next cycle or the cycle after that, using or it'll be put into a lining that is normal, that is physiological. Because one of the downsides of an IVF cycle, when we give the FSH to produce lots of eggs, we also produce very high estrogen levels. And what that does is result in a very thick lining of the womb, which is not normal. And it probably plays a part in some cycles not being successful. So with a frozen cycle, putting it back in a natural cycle or even a slightly stimulated cycle does not result in that thick lining of the womb. And probably that's why pregnancy rates are as good as they are. There's a debate about whether they might even be better. There are a couple of randomized controlled trials that suggest that might be the case, although I think the general view is that they're equivalent. There are specific indications to freeze all the embryos. So the first one is if you're going to have genetic testing of your embryos, because it takes a few days, even in the best labs, mostly it's 10 days, to get a result back. We can't put an embryo back in the cycle that we're testing the embryo. So that all of those embryos would get frozen after they were biopsied, and then in the following menstrual cycle, and the embryo that has a normal chromosome makeup would be put back. So that's one of the major indications for freezing all embryos. The next group, patients where we are worried about ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, and that putting an embryo back may make that situation worse.
And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey podcast from the navigation menu.